William Blum, historian and author of bestsellers like Rogue State and America's Deadliest Export, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us. Now, Hillary Clinton has announced she's running to become the Democrats' presidential candidate. Jeb Bush is also likely to put forward his bid for the Republicans. Now, Bush, Clinton, we've been here before. Who would be a better candidate, do you think? Not just for the U.S., but also for the world, like global peace efforts, for instance.
I don't think U.S. foreign policy will change at all, regardless of who's in the White House, Bush or Clinton or who else is running. Our policy does not change. Obama, I can add Obama to that. It wouldn't even matter which party it is, independent of which candidate. I mean, Republican or Democrat, they have the same foreign policy.
Why do you think it's the same policy for both parties? Why do you think there are no different from each other?
Because America, for 2 centuries, has had one basic overriding goal, and that is world domination. At least from the 1890s, if not earlier, one can say that. World domination is something which appeals to both Republicans and Democrats, or liberals or conservatives. The idea that we, the exceptional nation, have something very important to impart to the rest of the world. Our marvelous values, American exceptionalism, each party believes in that very, very strongly. There's no, they don't argue about that at all, except during a campaign debate. They'll take certain opposing views just to appear different. But in power, they have the exact same policy, world domination.
Now, back in 2009, President Obama made it clear that the missile shield in Europe would no longer be necessary if the threat from Iran were eliminated and a nuclear deal with Iran were struck. Now, a historic deal is close, but NATO is saying there will be no change in the missile shield plans. Why not?
Because NATO shares America's desire to dominate the world. NATO is just an arm of U.S. foreign policy. There's no point actually in making a distinction between U.S. foreign policy and NATO policy. They are the same. If the U.S. was not in NATO, NATO would not exist. The U.S. founded NATO. The U.S. is its main supporter and financial source. There's no distinction between the U.S. and NATO, and they share the same view of American world domination. And so it doesn't matter whether Iran is doing this or that. They know that Iran is not a lover of the empire, and anyone who is not a lover of the empire has a short lifespan. Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, whatever, that is the test. Do you love the empire or not?
But can we be a little more precise about this domination theory? NATO has been strengthening its eastern borders with a military building up on Russia's doorsteps at a rapid reaction force to include 30,000 personnel. Why this deployment? Who is it aimed against?
It's aimed against Russia. The U.S. cannot stand anyone who might stand in the way of the empire's expansion. And Russia and China are the only nations which can do that. Other nations, like Cuba or Iran or Venezuela, are regarded as enemies just as well because they have the power to influence. Cuba has influenced all of the Western Hemisphere. That makes them a great enemy. But the basic criterion is the empire's expansion and whether you support the empire or not. And that excludes all the countries I've named, from Cuba to Russia.
So,
I think this may sound simple.
Do you think the U.S. would go as far as using force against its enemies?
Well, the U.S. has used force against its enemies on a regular basis for 2 centuries. Of course they would use force. They've used force against Cuba. They invaded Cuba. and they've supported Cuban exiles in all kinds of violent activities for 60 years. Violence is never far removed from U.S. policy. Let me summarize something for the benefit of our listeners. Since 1946, the United States has attempted to overthrow more than 50 foreign governments. In that same time period, it has attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. It has bombed the people of 30 countries. It has suppressed revolutionary parties in at least 20 nations. And there's more to that. I forget my other factor on my list. This is a record unparalleled in all of human history. And there's no reason to think it's changing or will change, except if some superior force comes on the scene and can actually defeat the United States.
But, you know, the French intelligence, and France seems to be an ally of the United States. The French intelligence chief has recently said they found no evidence of Russia planning to invade Ukraine. So why has NATO been pressing these claims of an imminent invasion so hard and for so long?
Because Russia has the two characteristics of an enemy which Washington cannot tolerate. One, it has very powerful military capabilities, and two, it is not a client of Washington's policies. It's not a great admirer of the empire. The same applies to China. That's all it takes. You don't admire us, and you have a military force. That's all it takes to be a major enemy of Washington.
But the problem is that there's a ceasefire that seems to be in place, right? But U.S. paratroopers have arrived in Ukraine to train forces in the country, and it's not the first such deployment we've seen. So with the ceasefire agreement and the peace deal underway, why is Washington sending troops now?
Yeah, because they know very well that Ukraine is not, or those who support Russia, who live in Ukraine, Washington knows very well that these people are not on their side and will not be on their side, and there's no way to make them on our side. So the U.S. is expecting to wipe them out militarily at some point in the near future, as soon as they can get all the politics in place. There's no backtracking from these policies. I must say, repeat myself again. Washington wants to dominate the world, and anyone, including the people of Ukraine and the southeastern part of Ukraine, who don't share that view, they are enemies. And at some point, they may be met with military force.
So are you saying that America doesn't want peace in Ukraine because the U.S. is sending military personnel to Ukraine, like I've said, while Europeans are negotiating peace without American involvement?
Washington is not looking for peace or war. It's looking for domination. And if they can achieve domination peacefully, that's fine. If they can't, they'll use war. It's that simple.
So like you said, America is one of the main financiers of NATO. So there's also Estonia, and they meet NATO's funding goals. Why are the rest of its members lagging behind? Isn't the alliance important to them as well?
They each have their own home politics to deal with. They each have their own financial needs to deal with. They each have their own relation with Washington to deal with. It varies. This is not exactly the same in each country, but overall, no member of NATO is going to fight against Washington. No member of NATO is going to support the insurgents in Ukraine. Not one. So there's no need to dwell upon who is not paying and who is paying. None of them will ever go against Washington's policies in Ukraine or elsewhere.
Now, on the other hand, Europe, U.S., and Russia, they share similar security threats. Issues like Syria, Islamic State, there's Afghanistan, and they're not going anywhere. Can these states work together if it's absolutely necessary, for example?
They don't have the same security threats. Washington just announces that various countries are enemies of the U.S. That doesn't make them a threat. Syria, for example, is no threat to the United States. Neither was Iraq. Neither was Libya. The U.S. invades one country after another, totally independent of whether they're a threat or not. As long as they don't believe in the empire, as long as they're helping enemies of the empire. I mean, what threat was Libya to Washington? The U.S. and NATO invaded them without mercy, bombed them out of existence. They were a failed state now. What was the threat? There's no threat. If Russia doesn't announce Libya as a threat, it's not because Russia has a different foreign policy. It's because Russia is not so paranoid as the U.S. And Russia is not looking for world domination.
Russia has been criticized many times for its decision to supply air defense missile system to Iran. Now, why is America so worried about the anti-air missile defense Iran may buy from Russia? I mean, it's not like Washington's got plans to bomb Iran, right?
Well, no, of course they do. So does Israel. You can't put aside those fears. Washington, as I mentioned before, has bombed more than 30 countries. Why would they stop now? Iran is a definite target of the U.S. and of Israel, and it's very understandable that Iran would want to have advanced missile defense systems.
But look, the U.S. is staying out of Yemen now. It's not willing to commit ground troops to Iraq or get involved in Syria. I mean, it sometimes looks like, Washington is growing wary of foreign interventions lately.
No, they're still supporting the enemies of Syria. They are making sure that Assad will not come back to power. They are bombing places all over Syria which can be useful militarily to Syria. They have not forgotten about Syria at all. And Iraq is at the moment an ally, but tomorrow or yesterday it's something different. You can't just look at today and say they're not fighting here or there and think, oh, Washington has finally found peace. No, their basic goal is unchanged today or tomorrow or next year. And I must say again for the 10th time, it's world domination.
Now, you've written in one of your books, The Rogue State, that if you were president, you'd end all U.S. foreign intervention at once. Can the U.S. do that? I mean, is it that simple? The U.S. left Iraq and look what happened.
If I were the president, yes, that's what I would do. I would do all kinds of things. And then I add, the portion you're quoting, I add at the end of that paragraph, on my 5th day in office, I would be assassinated. So that's what happens to people who want to challenge the empire's policies. But I would have a great time for the first few days.
But can the U.S. realistically do that and all their foreign interventions at once? Because we see an example of Iraq that once they left, ISIS spread.
The U.S. is created ISIS. Let me point this out. Up until a short while ago, there were 4 major states in the Middle East and in South Asia which were secular. The U.S. invaded Iraq, and then invaded Libya and overthrew that secular government. And then it's been in the process now for some years, attempting to overthrow the secular government of Syria. Is it any wonder that the Middle East and South Asia have been taken over by religious fanatics? All the possible enemies and barriers to that have been wiped out by Washington. Why will they stop now?